recently, I debated a gentleman and some follow-up discussions with someone who's like a more fiery proponent of the position of this idea that the Apostle Paul was invented by Rome. I'm sorry, Christianity was essentially invented by Rome via primarily the vehicle of Apostle Paul. And so the idea with that is sometimes it's called the Flavian thesis. Sometimes they call it Roman provenance. Not real prominent, but let me see. I think I got...
I wouldn't imagine it would be prominent.
No, of course not. But if you've seen the Joseph Atwill stuff, Caesar's Messiah, that's on that kind of track. And there's a attempt to be academic book, Operation Messiah, St. Paul, Roman Intelligence, and the Birth of Christianity. Gotta love the title.
Yeah.
So now we're not going to talk about that, right? I'm not going to talk about that. Nick calls him the Apostle Paul 007. Roman Empire creating a religion that would ultimately triumph over it is just... Yeah, I agree. Now, we're not going to talk about that, but this does relate. I've been looking at Pauline Studies lately, just as not getting a PhD in the field or anything like that, but I've been looking at Apostle Paul studies, and you and I talked, and I said, let's talk about who really is the Apostle Paul, the historical Apostle Paul. How can we know who he really is? Do we have good reason for believing what the Scripture says about him is true? How much can we ascertain? What role do scholarly studies play in all this? And so what are some of your main interests and angles that you come at studying the Apostle Paul for you? Is it via studying justification? And what are some of the primary ways that you've got into this topic apologetic-wise? What brought you there deeper?
Yeah, so I love all things Pauline. I wouldn't claim to be equally proficient in all the different areas you can get into. The field of Pauline Studies is incredibly large. But one of the things I love in reading Paul is his profound insight into what he refers to as the mystery of Christ. And just to give a little bit of insight into the sort of thing I have in mind here, which may not be as well known to people. If you look at Paul's Damascus Road experience, the account given of his conversion to Christ, Luke gives three versions, one in Acts 9, one in Acts 22, one in Acts 26. One of them is a first-person account of it. What's interesting when you look at it, a number of scholars have pointed this out, they read very much like an Old Testament theophany, not just a theophany, but we can even narrow it down. When you look at Old Testament theophanies, they're of different sorts. The appearance to Abraham is pretty remarkable to me because it's very mundane. There's not even any indication to Abraham at first that it's God who's standing before him with two others. But usually you get these more spectacular appearances of God appearing to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3, or the pillar of fire and cloud in Exodus 13 and 14, or the mountain itself being ablaze in Exodus 19 through 24. These are these large-scale theophanies. Well, usually in a call narrative of an Old Testament prophet, there's an appearance of God. We don't have the call narrative of every prophet, but every call narrative we have, it is marked by a theophany. And this is important for a prophet in his future work. He has to know that what he's saying is from God. Well, anyways, one of the call narratives and theophanies of the Old Testament is the one found in Ezekiel 1, where Ezekiel talks about having visions of God by the Kebar River. When you look at that account, it's pretty awesome the way that it describes God's appearance there. But when you compare that to Paul's Damascus Road experience, it seems quite evident that Paul's experience is being modeled on that appearance to Ezekiel. In fact, there's terms and expressions used by Ezekiel that are used by Luke in his account of Paul's experience. And even the chronology is the same when you look at the different elements. Moreover, there's a particular phrase in the theophany to Ezekiel that only appears one other time in all of Greek literature. I'm thinking here of the Septuagint form of the vision to Ezekiel. It's only found one other time. That's in Paul's conversion account. So my point with this is, here you have not just an account of Paul's conversion, but some indication of who Christ is. This makes all the more significant Paul's question, "Who are you, Lord?" He's experiencing the very thing that was experienced by the prophets in the Old Testament, and he's asking this individual who he is, and doing so in terms of the Old Testament kurios language.
The takeaway of the connection for you, and apologetically, theologically, between the Old Testament prophetic calls and Paul's conversion accounts, the takeaway for you is what? Because I've seen some of these guys be like, well, it's clear that the gospel writers and Acts, they're imitating and making up stories with Old Testament language and all that, but it's more evidence it didn't happen. But the reason why you thought it was significant to point that out was because...
Well, it shows, however you assess this, what valuation you put on it, whether it's true or false. The point is, this is what is being communicated by the author of the accounts. Jesus is very clearly in these accounts being identified as Lord. And so if it's true, then it carries with it, right? If Paul was called in this way, then it carries with it some implications for the identity of the one who called him. And of course, we can get into the veracity of it, and maybe you do want to do that, of course. But my point is just that's significant to me, and this shows that people who want to say that belief in the deity of Christ, for example, is a late innovation are just wrong. Some will allow that it was introduced with Paul, but that's a problem. You don't get much of an evolutionary theory off the ground if you've already got it being taught by Paul. Or by Luke, his traveling companion. If it's already being taught in these sources, then it's remarkably early. Where's the room for evolution?
Right. So you're saying that this shows, whereas you have, it's obviously Yahweh calling these Old Testament prophets. Not that Jesus is in the place of Yahweh, but that Jesus is to be identified as Yahweh. I don't know what language you'd want to put it in, but with the way it's in the New Testament shape of it. And so, as you said, aptly, it's not just telling you something about Paul, it's telling you something about Jesus. And so you would say, even whether it's true or not, it's still revealing early Christian Christology, that it's high.
Yes.
Now,
so that would be one area. There are a bunch of other things, obviously, that I'm interested in terms of Paul.
Do you think there's a short version of an answer to the contradictions that people say are there between the conversion accounts? Because I'm sure someone's listening and they're like, yeah, but they contradict. In fact, that's one of the things that when I discuss Acts with a non-believer, sometimes that's one of the first things they bring up. It's somewhat well-known trope to trot out, it seems like, at least in some of my interactions with people, the idea, well, these things contradict each other.
But I don't think they do. I mean, so they'd have to do something more than just say that, right?
Well, yeah, of course I agree.
I mean, obviously there's the classic ones. Did they hear or not hear, that kind of thing. But even in English, we can say that somebody heard and didn't hear, and not be contradicting ourselves. We can be using the term hear in different senses. You can say to your son, "Did you hear me?" He can say, "Yeah," and still not do what you say. And then you'll say, "You didn't hear me. You weren't listening," right? Because what you're saying is there's a sense of hearing that refers to a sound striking your eardrum, and a sense of hearing that translates into action. You're actually receiving it and acting upon it, and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I think there's answers to these sorts of things. And Rob Bowman, on that particular one, by the way, wrote a good article on this many years ago.
Oh, he did?
I know that's not the only point of disparity that people will try and point to, but that's usually the classic one that I hear the most.
Is it in jets, or where did he put that?
I can't even remember. It's been so long, but I mean, I could probably find it pretty easily.
I'd love to. I would love to see it. White Lily asks, how do they, I guess the they there would be skeptics, something like that, take into account the fact that Paul became the very thing he hated, literally risking his life and later getting killed, if all of this was made up? What do you think?
How do they do it?
I'm saying, is that a good question?
Oh, yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've got to account for why Paul made this huge change. You can't just say that he did and point to examples of people making big changes as though that's adequate, because when people make huge changes like this, there's some rationale, there's some explanation for it. What's the explanation in the case of Paul? Typically, when people start new religions or do things of this sort, there's three main things that they're after: money, power, and lust. These are the pursuits, right? These are the motivations: lust, greed, and power. But Paul didn't get any of those by Bowman. And this is on Academia EDU.
All right, I'll look
but that's not where that's not where it originally appeared, of course.
I gotcha. I understand. I'll look at it right now.
I mean, I was trying to.
So you're saying, hey, what would be the motivation there?
Why would
page? I'll post the link.
I mean, think the other thing is, if people try and do something like switch from this other position to this new one, motivated by lust, greed, or power, not only did Paul not get that and seem to not want it, I mean, he's doing everything opposite of what you'd expect, but he's even giving that up to some extent. As a Pharisee, Paul had all sorts of things going for him. He wasn't just your run-of-the-mill Pharisee. He mentions that he was excelling. He was especially zealous and making great strides in Judaism. And when you look at him in the book of Acts prior to his conversion, he's exercising a prominent role. He's actually there giving his approval at the death of Stephen. Later, he gets letters to go hunting around the world for Jews to bring them back to Jerusalem. So he's no small figure, but when he becomes a Christian, he's giving all that up.
Some people at that point,
even
go ahead.
Even the early Christians.
I just dropped the link in there, by the way. And
okay.
You know what's funny? That article, it's from it's when you and I were roommates in Providence.
Oh, is it that ETS?
Yeah, it's Providence 2017. Then. I see on the header now. It's at the annual meeting in Providence when we met up with Tony Tabano.
Okay.
When I clogged the... remember?
Yeah.
Truth Defender says that Saul was gangster. He was known, feared, and respected.
Yeah, that's. I don't know if I said it, but I was about to at least. That Paul not only doesn't get the acclaim that you would assume someone who has no good reasons for the switch, he doesn't get that. I mean, he gives it up to some extent by leaving his post in Judaism, but then even all the early Christians are suspicious of Paul. He doesn't just immediately get the right hand of fellowship from everybody. People are worried about him. Even Ananias, when the Lord appeared to him and told him to receive Paul, baptize him, and so forth, Ananias was like, Lord, we've heard about this man. I always get a kick out of how people respond in these theophanies, that, sort of like they're informing God. You remember Moses when he's telling the Lord, I'm not a good speaker, Lord.
Mm-hmm.
You got the wrong man for the job. And the Lord replies, who is it that made man's mouth? Right. I think I know what I'm doing here.
I don't because White Lily said, how do skeptics respond? What I've seen response basically is they would say, well, there's contradictions in the account, so we can't really trust its historical reliability. And in fact, we can't really trust most of the book of Acts. And everyone knows that. That's what I hear or see a lot. All kinds of wild theories out there, Anthony. Dennis MacDonald. Acts is essentially written like an ancient sea voyage epic. If you've seen that kind of stuff. Acts is got connections with Josephus. It's in the style of a Homeric poem almost. I mean, all these kinds of things. It's interesting because we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the life of Jesus, Jesus' biography. But when it comes to the life of the church or the biography of the church, or if you want to narrow it down and say Paul, we just have Acts. So we can't do the common source. This guy portrays it this way. It's an interesting thing. For better or for worse, I think we're fine. I'm okay with it. There doesn't need to be 4 acts or anything like that. But in general, what kind of things do you talk about when you want to say, look, Acts is trustworthy, Acts is reliable, Acts is not some document that's just invented fiction? Do you have things you come off the cuff with?
Well, one thing is to think in terms of the way people, because they can't just say, okay, here's this other theory that discounts the reliability of Acts. There are many different proposals out there. Even among Christians, there's some discussion. What is it exactly that's Luke's thesis here? I remember going through seminary looking at different proposals. These are all believing approaches, and they're asking, what is it that he's doing here? Some people will say that it's a legal brief that Luke is preparing as Paul awaits trial in Rome. So he's giving the background of Christianity, and the perfect example of it, Paul on trial. But there are other ways that Christians have explained what's going on in the book of Acts. What's the central thing that Luke is doing? So you can't just throw out there your own idea and then just take it as a given. There's got to be some argument for it. Well, off the cuff, the kinds of arguments that I'm used to hearing are things like, when you see differences in terms of the theology of the different books, this is supposed to show that these things are not all of a piece, that there's some problem here. And what's interesting to me often is how people just arbitrarily flip a coin and decide which one they like to go with. So in the case of the Gospels, they'll say Mark gives us a low Christology, John gives us a high Christology, and the assumption is, well, Mark is the more reliable then. Well, why is that the case? Just because Mark gives a low Christology? Well, because the prejudice of the bias of the person who's assessing things this way doesn't like the notion of Christ's deity. So Mark becomes more reliable on that basis. But I disagree all across the board. I don't think any of the books of the New Testament teach a low Christology. I'm amazed at the high Christology found in all these books and how many people often miss it in many cases. So in the book of Acts, I don't see any higher or lower Christology than what I see elsewhere in Paul's writings, or than I see in the book of Mark or Luke or Matthew or what have you. I think that the way they do things is different. All of us, if you were to write to somebody what Christianity is and make a persuasive appeal to them to become a Christian, you and I are going to say some things that are the same, but you're going to have your own way of going about it. Just because you have a different way of doing it than I do doesn't mean that we have fundamentally different theologies. And that's basically what I think you see in the case of the Gospels. So I do think that, in fact, this can become an argument for the reliability of Acts. On their approach, they're going to say there's a difference between its theology and what you find elsewhere. I'm going to say it's the same. And so that argues to some extent, I wouldn't say it takes us the whole way, but it argues for, if you've got a consistent testimony here across these books, then it gives some reason to consider their testimony.
From what I've seen, you'll get this, hey, look, this Paul speaking in the book of Acts, his theology There's all this stuff you don't see him talking about. He's talking about in his letters. Luke's putting stuff in Paul's mouth. And besides, doesn't Paul in his letters say he's not a great speaker? And Luke seems to have him as a great speaker. And you'll see this kind of stuff. You'll see the vocabulary is very Lucan. It's not really always Pauline in Acts, the Paul of Acts. One thing I've noticed is the differences are overemphasized. So like something I brought up in the debate, Acts 13, 38, 39. That's just one place, but you read it and that's Paul speaking. It sounds exactly like Paul in the letters. And what I'm saying is you'll see, that is something Paul would say in the letters. I'll throw it in the chat later. But then there's times where I think we could agree, okay, Luke's a historian. He is writing this. That's true. And so I think a fairer question to ask in the situation is not strictly limited to vocabulary, but themes and motifs. And I think that's where you see the Paul of Acts is not in contradiction to the Paul of the epistles. Could I share something from John Dominic Crossan? Because
everybody's favorite.
He talks about this, and this is like a late-level book. But I'll show you the way people sometimes pit this. All right, here we go. All right, ready? And I'll let you cut in whenever you want. Page 151. In light of the divergence between Paul and Luke about his Damascus escape, so he's comparing 2 Corinthians 11 there with Acts 9, by the way, because one says King Aretas guarded the wall or guarded the city, or technically the governor under him. And then Acts says that the Jews plotted to kill him, and they watched the walls, gates day and night. That's one thing. Okay, so continue on here. I propose 3 principles for correlating Luke on Paul with Paul on Paul, and for integrating data in Luke's Acts and Paul's letters. So at least he's trying to tell you what his methodology is, for better or for worse, okay? The first principle is both easy and obvious. When Luke and Paul agree that he was a Jew, a Pharisee, and a persecutor of the early Christian community, I fully accept that common data. Real quick, notice there, just John Dominic Crossan, a skeptical scholar, he engages in higher criticism. I don't really think he believes in anything supernatural being possible based upon certain statements he made. The famous one about the trees being arranged in his front yard. I don't know if you know that quote, but he would look for another explanation. He couldn't be God type of thing. Well, you look at this and you say, he's got Paul as a Jew. So Paul's not an Edomite there. Don't think he's a Herodian. He's got him as a Pharisee. Well, he's not a secret agent there. He's not a lot of the stuff people try to make him out to be. A persecutor of the early Christian community. So that's his. This is John Dominic Crossan saying, look, you put the data together, it's a clear thing. So we don't accept it because John Dominic Crossan says it, but it's pointing out that a well-known, prestigious, prolific, highly acclaimed scholar even recognizes that basic stuff. The second principle is equally obvious but more controversial. What happens when Luke and Paul disagree? In that case, I follow Paul rather than Luke. For instance, Luke affirms that Paul does not. Luke affirms, but Paul does not, that Paul was a freeborn citizen of Rome and raised in Jerusalem as a student of Gamaliel II. On this point, I follow Paul, not Acts, but would not argue about it too strongly. Here is a much more important disagreement. When Paul affirms and Luke denies that Paul was an apostle called by God through Christ and equal in authority to the 12 apostles, I follow Paul, not Luke, and would argue about it very, very strongly, as would Paul himself.
So I just flat disagree with him in terms of the specifics there. I mean, it's interesting. He's telling us his approach, who he follows, who he doesn't, and that sort of thing. But the specific examples he gives, I'm curious what he thinks grounds those. I mean, I have some suspicions, but...
Well, what do you think? Have you ever heard that before, Anthony, where they say, hey, look, in Acts, he's never called an apostle. Luke denies him the right to be an apostle. What's up with that?
Well, first of all, I mean, when you look at the book of Acts itself, the beginning of the book it starts off on this issue of Judas's treachery and the need to replace him. Mm-hmm. And the bulk of the book, after the first 10 or so chapters, focuses on Paul, right? Even chapter 8 says something about Paul. Chapter 9, of course, is his Damascus Road experience. But after you get this statement of, or what Peter and Cornelius and so forth in Acts 10, it almost all turns to Paul. You can't have in this book the idea that Luke is starting off and putting all this emphasis on the apostleship and the activity of the apostles, and then just suddenly loses sight of all that, and suddenly starts talking for the almost the entirety of the book, or the majority of the book, about this guy who's not an apostle. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And besides that, the criteria given for being an apostle is very clearly something Luke is concerned to convey. You had to be a witness of Christ's resurrection. Well, Luke gives the conversion account of Paul 3 times. That's what I call an emphasis. You don't have anybody else's conversion account given that many times.
They're trying to push that he didn't see, I think, the risen Christ and wasn't with them in the beginning. I think what they're trying to push, Anthony, is the idea that Luke's credentials, as they would say, explicitly deny Paul to be an apostle. I think that's the way they're trying to angle it. I don't know if New Testament theologist is still in here. He could shed some light.
Yeah, so if the emphasis is on seeing Christ, it can't be seeing the risen Christ, because, again, that's emphasized 3 times. If they want to say he didn't see Christ in his earthly ministry, that's debatable.
Oh, that's the next question I was going to ask you.
Well, ask it. No.
Okay. Nick pushes the idea, and he says that Stanley Porter is presenting some new evidence for this. That if you construct it properly in the Greek, a possible interpretation of Paul when he says, hey, we don't judge anyone any longer according to the flesh. That little section, that part, and I can read it here in a second if you're not, because I'm not citing it. I'm just, if it's not making sense what I'm saying.
We don't know Christ after the flesh any longer.
Yes, he's saying that could indicate Paul met Jesus. I had never thought about that before. I'd love to hear the Anthony Rogers opinion.
So I'd have to think about that particular verse and see Porter's arguments. Porter's no slouch when it comes to Greek and all that, so I mean I wouldn't treat it lightly. But when I just take a step back and I think about this question, the possibility and even the probability of Paul knowing Jesus, first of all, there's just no way Paul didn't know about Jesus. Right? Yeah. We could start here. Paul is a Jew. He's a Pharisee. He's very much interested in what's happening, and he lives in Jerusalem, and he was a student of Gamaliel's. He's there at the stoning of Stephen, so he's obviously active on this front. And so how could Paul possibly not know about this guy Jesus who's causing all this fervor, right, and uproar and so forth? I mean, even before Jesus, John the Baptist garnered a lot of attention, so much so that Jesus, when he goes in on his final entrance into Jerusalem and cleanses the temple, they ask him, by what authority are you doing this? Jesus mentions John the Baptist. I'll ask you a question. John the Baptist, did he do what he did with divine authority, or was it merely human in origin? And he's putting them on the horns of a dilemma. They know that all the people love John, and so they can't condemn John outright, but if they affirm John, then they have to accept Jesus' authority because John pointed to Jesus. So John already stirred up a lot of attention. They even, it says the Pharisees sent priests and Levites to John to question him about who he was, way back when he was baptizing in the desert and so forth. So John's already stirring things up.
In fact,
then Jesus comes along.
To your point, Anthony, and I hope I'm contributing. Sometimes I get comments say interrupt too much. I hope I'm not, Anthony. I want to just talk to you. Not you, but I'm just saying.
It gives me a chance to drink my coffee.
Good, okay. It's funny because you're all rough and tumble with the hoodie and a beard, and a black beanie, and then you got this Christmas cup coffee from Starbucks.
I'm Italian, and we need our espresso.
You know the
In fact, this is your route. This is a Doppio. Doppio.
Oh, you got a Doppio.
Yeah.
That's funny. You remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. So now okay. So, check the. Now I forget. Oh, Josephus, Jewish historian. To your point about, John the Baptist and stirring up notice and whatnot. The proper understanding of the entry on Jesus, because listen, everybody, Josephus does mention Jesus. It's been lengthened by later scribes, but there's a smaller portion that most certainly is what Josephus really said about him. That's my position. I believe that's true. But when you take those two together, the Josephus entry and the John the Baptist, I think the John the Baptist entry is longer than the one on Jesus by Josephus. You know what I'm saying? That, or at least equal. I forgot. There's like a word count with it, but he takes notice. He takes notice. Similar thing with James the Just, as far as the length and all of that.
And when you look at the gospel accounts, they all treat John. None of them skip over John. This is very different than us, right? We could easily tell somebody the gospel without thinking we need to talk about John. But the gospel writers don't do that. They all talk about John. And when you look at the sermons in the book of Acts, they very often bring up John. So John was significant. And so my point is, so John is raising a lot of attention and he's pointing to Jesus. Jesus is raising even more attention. There's just no way that somebody like Paul is not aware of these things. It's just, I can't even imagine how that happens, right? Here's this guy who's so prominent in the Judaism of his day, and they're taking note of what's happening. The rest, right? They're sending a delegation to John. And so then Jesus is doing all these things throughout Israel, and then he goes to Jerusalem. How do we expect somebody like Paul is not trying to get within earshot? Paul's not, it's not like he's just suddenly the kind of person that wants to kill people that, this isn't something out of the blue. It's a feature of his character. He's a zealous individual. And so what was he doing during the time when Jesus is ministering in Israel and then going up to Jerusalem? So I just don't think it's very feasible that Paul didn't know about Jesus. And I think it's very probable, just in light of this, that he did see him or hear him on some occasion. So then the thing that you're bringing up with Porter is intriguing if there's a specific statement that would lead to this. I do know that when you think about, there are certain statements about seeing Jesus that one could well ask, is this talking about his Damascus Road experience or something else? So like 1 Corinthians 9:1, Paul says, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Notice the connection there between being an apostle and having seen Jesus. If the criteria to be an apostle is that you were a witness to him in his earthly ministry, then that would be a natural way of understanding having seen Jesus. So I don't by any stretch discount it. I think it's highly likely.
Excellent. Few comments from the live chat. Gospel Truth. Marlon says, Anthony, I hope you're ready for Friday.
Anthony can't wait.
Shout out to Marlon. Marlon, we got a debate January 12th between myself and Judah Natsara on is Isaiah 53 about Jesus. I think it's going to be good. White Lily says, even if there's a contradiction, which there isn't, his conversion is still evident. The man used to be a successful Pharisee who ended up being a tent maker. That's a good point. It's interesting when you look at historical accounts, right? Even regular old history, right? Historians don't go, there's some discrepancies between these two accounts. Therefore, it didn't happen and the people didn't exist. That's not what they do. That's not what they do.
But
Even
Richard
just
Carrier
regular,
does.
huh?
Richard Carrier does.
Yeah, Richard Carrier does. Mr. Green reads, just finished up Craig Keener's work on Acts. His summarized book, not the 4-volume set he did. What do you think of the Keener on Acts stuff there?
So I have not read it. I do have other Keener stuff I've got his commentary on Galatians I've been going through. In fact, one year at ETS, I don't know if you were there
We sat
at
with
the
them.
table with us. Yeah, were you at that
we
table?
all sat with them.
Then I probably have you in the picture. Yeah. So he's
Probably
impressive,
not.
cranking out books at the pace he does, and the volume.
Yeah,
that
how
those
does he
books,
do it?
He's like Origin or something. I think somebody follows him around and he dictates. I don't know.
Those books are so thick and the footnotes are so copious.
Yeah. And the Acts is 4 volumes, right? So
yeah,
I have
4 volumes, and they're all really, really large volumes. That's why you got to get that summarized one, unless you're superhuman, you know.
Yeah. So I do like a lot of stuff from Keener.
Yeah, I think he's great. Yeah, good point in the live chat here. I got another one. True life. I'm going to read this comment. I'm not exactly sure what it has to do with anything, but I'm going to read it as it is. Okay, Anthony? Jesus Christ is a Mexican, not Israeli. Clearly the world been lied to. Jesus' father was a carpenter. Name the people who builds. Mexicans. Oh my. The Vatican got y'all ass real good. Jesus Christ is.
He has the Mexican flag.
Who cares?
I think that
Y'all
might be satire, right?
a lie that he still hasn't figured out. Use common sense to cap it on my name. I'm thinking this is a parody account. That's what I'm thinking. I'm not sure. Let's see. By the way, I just got a Cash App from somebody who wants me to set up a Sakari debate from TL. Shout out to you, TL. Thank you for that. I'll see what I can do, but I do appreciate that very much. And you guys can hit off the Cash App. It's at Street Apologist, or PayPal's at Vocab Malone. Okay. I was going to read a little bit more of the John Dominic Crossan if I could, though, because I'd love to get your opinion on this. So we're trying to find out the truth about who really was Paul. Can we trust Acts when we read Paul? How do we know? And then after this, I want to kind of transition a little bit into his authority and hopefully these letters as well. Third principle. This is page 152. John Dominic Crossan says this. Third principle is the hardest of the 3 to use, and maybe even to understand. What about Lucan data that neither agree nor disagree with Pauline data? What if it is simply new information? When Luke has information that is neither in Paul's own data nor against Paul's data, I accept it if it can be correlated with Pauline rather than Lucan themes. A simple example is Luke's assertion in Acts 9:11, Acts 21:39, and Acts 22:3 that Paul came from Tarsus. Paul never confirms that explicitly, but Tarsus was the capital of the Roman province of Cilicia, and it may well be that Paul's strategic focus on Roman provincial capitals, Antioch for Syria, Thessalonica for Macedonia, Corinth for Achaia, Ephesus for Asia, and maybe even Ancyra for Galatia, implicitly confirms Luke's information. Paul is a man of capitals, and indicates what follows is a much more significant example, one that is basic and constitutive for my interpretation of Paul. And then he goes into something else. What do you think of that last one?
I'd have to think about that a little more, but one thing is what Luke is saying in Acts 9 and the other passages he gave. Luke's not making a statement. I mean, I know he's recording it, but what he's recording is what was understood to be the case with respect to Paul. He says he doesn't just speak of Paul being from Tarsus. He's called Paul the Tarsian. Most translations don't render it literally, but the whole idea is that in the first century, people didn't have last names, so there had to be a way of disambiguating who you meant when you used a name for somebody that 10 other people had, right, in that vicinity. So there would be different ways you'd disambiguate them. There would be a patronymic. You would maybe make reference to that person's father. Rarely a matronymic. Sometimes there would be a reference to, let's say, Boanerges in reference to James and John, some quality about them. But another prominent way was by referring to where they're from. And Paul is known as the Tarsian. So when you look at Acts 23, for example, actually 22, Paul says, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated under Gamaliel. When you look at that, the reason Paul says this, you might think it doesn't make sense for Paul to start this way. They're in an uproar over Paul, supposedly violating the sanctity of the temple, right? So you would think, why would Paul bring up this idea that he's a Tarsian? It would seem to cater to that you're compromised, you're influenced by Hellenism, that sort of thing. But Paul knows that everybody knows he's the Tarsian, right? So he has to throw this out there. He's getting in front of this, in other words. Right? You know what I mean? He's saying, yeah, I'm the Tarsian, right? But then he goes on to explain, but I was educated at the feet of Gamaliel. I'm as Jewish as they come, right? So my point is just to say that, yeah, Luke is giving us this information. Paul doesn't explicitly mention it, but I don't know why Crossan's criteria is necessary. It seems to me pretty easy to recognize this is the sort of thing that's true, because it holds these accounts together, and Luke would be writing to no purpose. How's he being persuasive to people with respect to Paul if what he's saying isn't well known? You know what I mean? There's no point to Luke even bringing this up. Why would Luke make up that he's a Tarsian to persuade them that he's not Hellenized? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Do you think
Paul...
Oh, sorry, go ahead. You finish? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to repeat myself.
Nah. Do you think Luke had access to Paul's letters, or some of them?
Sure, some of them.
That's like a big...
At least.
That's another big sort of debate I hear people.
There's an interesting book, I'm still working through it, by Benjamin Laird called The Pauline Corpus or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he did another book recently where there's a section, it's on the New Testament canon, but there's a section dealing with Paul. And he mentions a corpus of Paul's writings. He mentions the practice of people in the first century when they would write something, they would not only write one thing and then put it into the hands of a courier to then take it to the recipients. They would write a duplicate for themselves and keep it in their own possession.
Yes.
And so as Paul's writing, he would continue to add to that, so that Laird talks about what he thinks is evidence for a three-stage development of the Pauline corpus, because obviously it's not completed at once, so that it would be at various stages of completion. And the same thing would be happening in the churches. When a church receives one of Paul's epistles, they're also storing it. And then if they get another epistle from Paul, they would be putting these together with it. And so you can actually look at the historical evidence and see that there's collections of Paul's writings circulating around. And so my point is that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul's, and Paul would have had these in his collections. Why wouldn't he? And he's a historian.
Mm-hmm.
Paul knew Luke's writing.
I heard also that it is possible that Luke could have access to some of Paul's speeches, because we have examples in the ancient world where people actually wrote what they were going to say down. They had an outlining type of thing. There's some examples I've seen the people gave from the Greco-Roman world. And if Paul ever did that, Luke would have access to that, because it's usually assumed it's just like, hey, this is all by memory. He heard what he heard and then he tries his best type of thing. But I've also seen that there's some evidence that he could have had essentially the outline of the speech, like in written form, as a possibility. And of course, if he is a traveling companion to Paul, that's something that can be discussed. Remember you said this, what did you say here? Da, 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 that kind of thing together. A lot of interesting stuff to consider. The idea of Paul with a letter writer, as Paul as a letter writer, I've got a couple books that sort of talk about that, and I think they're very interesting. One, for example, is called Paul in First Century Letter Writing, Secretary's Composition and Collection, E. Randolph Richards, 2004. And it gets into a lot of this stuff, you know. And one thing that's interesting, Anthony, is it talks about, you know, sometimes we might think of inspiration as a process. A guy sits down and then he's got his little, a lot of times I notice they like to have a skull. You know, they're writing and they have a skull beside them. I don't know what that's about. Have you seen those paintings?
Yeah, I don't know what it's about either.
He's got a skull. He's got a candle. He's got his quill pen. He's got the scroll, you know, or the parchment, whatever. It's kind of a dark room, and then he's done. Well, what if that's not how it was? What if Paul's writing certain parts of the letter in some places, and then in other places? Obviously not the case with the prison epistles, right? But on the ones where he's sort of on the go. And what if there's even some writing by committee, which is not impossible. Paul had companions, Paul had people he worked with. And you could even see, hey, I'm going to say this to the church. What's a good word to use here? That's what I mean by that. And then Paul has the final decision, and maybe he's either writing it or tells the Amensuus, the ancient secretary, what to say. Or he gives the secretary, the Amensuus, I think that's how you say it, some freedom. Hey, let's communicate this. Let me hear what you write. Just the exploring possibilities. I'm open to those possibilities. They don't, to me, destroy my theology of inspiration for what it's worth. Have you ever seen that where like sort of it could be a much messier, human, organic, busy, incidental process?
Well, for people who have a low view of God's sovereignty and providence, that would be problematic, I would think. But if you have a high view of those things, it's not problematic at all. We believe that God superintended the process. So humans and all their frailties and weaknesses are involved, but God is superintending it all, ensuring that it ultimately ends up being exactly what he wants it to be. So, you know, when you look at the Old Testament, we're used to thinking about this in the New Testament, but this might help people kind of think about it a little more. But the book of Genesis was written by Moses. If we believe the biblical account of these things, the Torah is written by Moses.
It, of course, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that means that Moses is writing about things that happened long before he was alive. And how did that happen? Obviously, we believe it's inspired, but what we know in the case of Luke, that Luke's inspired account, I'm here speaking, of course, as a Christian. Obviously, skeptics don't just grant this, but I'm saying he says it right there. Luke's not hiding anything. He's saying, I investigated these things, right? I'm writing down the results of my investigation. Well, that being the case, we're open to that possibility when it comes to the book of Genesis. One of the things that people have said in the case of Genesis is that the Toledot structure, when you look in Genesis, it'll say, various times it'll say, these are the generations of. And there's 10 Toledot statements in Genesis, and many people think that these represent 10 accounts of the periods that come after them. So
kind of like, and that's the end of my part. Next guy signing off. Here we go.
Yeah. And so there's possibility that these patriarchal records were handed down and eventually came into the possession of Moses. You know, it's interesting to me, thinking of Moses in this respect, when you look at the genealogies that are given, the names of the people of Israel at the time of Moses, we have an account, for example, in Exodus 6. None of the names have the name of God in them. There are no theophoric names until after the time of Moses.
Like you're talking about the Jeremiah, Isaiah.
Yeah. Right. So either a name will have El or Yah, or if, depending on if it's at the beginning or the end of the word. But there is one exception. Moses' mother's name is Jochebed, which means Yahweh is glorious. So we know that at least in his family, the faith in the Lord had been kept alive. Whatever else might have been true of the Israelites in general after 400 years, we know that in Moses' family there's still some knowledge of the God of Israel. Moreover, there's an interesting expression in Exodus 3 when the Lord appeared to Moses at the bush. He said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Notice that first part, I'm the God of your father. So he's saying, your father looked to me as his God. And so
that's in Exodus.
My point is, yeah, Exodus 3 at the burning bush.
Okay, I don't remember if I caught that before. That's good.
Yeah, so my point is just to say that Moses' family is a pious, believing Israelite family during a period when the worship of the true God may well have dwindled because of their many years in bondage and in Egypt and so forth. And he would be the perfect person to be the recipient of those things. And in any case, we believe that Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days with God. This is where the Jews think he got the oral Torah from, right?
Exodus 3:6. Good.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I'm just saying that there's nothing in the nature of our belief in inspiration that precludes this sort of thing, that he's actually using pre-existing sources. We see it in the New Testament, and there's plenty to think this is the case in the Old Testament as well.
No doubt.
So,
go ahead.
Another thing is, along these lines, there have been some who have argued that there might well have been different versions of some of the epistles. So originals, I mean. So, and I'm not saying I agree with this, I'm just pointing this out. There's nothing inconsistent here with our belief that these things are accurate and true and all that. We can believe that God intended something to be preserved and for the church, and maybe other things that weren't intended to have that durability. But some have said that some of the epistles were originally written, let's say, to Rome. But then what if Paul wanted another group to know these things as well and just took off the concluding section where he's addressing people in house churches in Rome, right? There have been people who have said that this is a possibility, and it wasn't out of accord with first century practice, that people could write the same thing multiple times and maybe just make some slight changes to make it more relevant to this other audience.
I agree. Real quick, I see that yesterday, no one, I don't know if it's the same one as No Name, sent something through the Cash App, and then TL. So we have a couple Cash App donations, so we're going to give the dog a treat. It's not a super chat, but it's Cash App donation. There's one, and then there's two. Adrian, that's right. Yeah.
Hey, yo, Adrian.
Yeah, she's happy. Okay, now, a couple questions, and then we'll get into the epistles. So try to keep this quick. Purely Grounded says, from what I understand, Paul's tent making in the Greek land would be totally plausible. They'd get bought up easily there due to the lifestyle events and would also give him time to preach, win souls, da-da-da. Thoughts on the tent making thing? One thing that's interesting with the Roman Herodian thesis, for example, it seems unlikely Paul would be a tent maker, if he's essentially in some way tied up with the Roman aristocracy or something like that, because they weren't really into that type of thing, is my understanding, especially the elites of society, and yet he's out here being a tent maker. But of course, people may just say, well, Acts is inaccurate. But anything to say about Paul being a tent maker?
Well, it would tie in with his birth in Tarsus, right?
Why is that?
Tarsus was a significant place that manufactured or that produced material woven from goat hair known as silicium, which was used in making tents. Okay. So it's very likely that, if that's how you understand the word, there are people that would say that the word translated tent maker could just mean leather worker, but the standard way of viewing it is tent maker, and it fits perfectly with Paul's Cilician background.
What about this? Truth Defender says that I taught Rogers everything he knows. Prove me wrong.
I have nothing to say. I'm
called
letting
you
him have his claim to fame. He's claiming to be my Gamaliel.
Yeah, he is. Captain Rogers, captain of the SS Heretic Slayer. That's you,
May
man.
it be true. May it be true. No.
All right, LJ says, what about Messianic Jews who believe in Jesus but still hold on to the Torah, since Paul specifies in Galatians, even if an angel from heaven, let him be anathema. So I think he's saying, Messianic Jews who in some way observe elements of Old Testament law, or are they out of step with what Paul was saying in Galatians? I think that's what he's asking.
Well, one, if somebody insists on the necessity of observing the Torah in order to be justified, that Paul contradicts. If somebody insists that as a Jew that a Gentile is obligated to follow the Torah in order to be fully included and, all that would be wrong too. Those are the things that Paul opposes. But I wouldn't say that he just lock, stock, and barrel rejects following Mosaic law for a Jew.
Yeah, he did the Nazirite vow stuff.
Yeah. And there, we also have to take into account there's an interim period between Christ coming, dying, rising again, and the destruction of the temple. There's this 40-year period during which Israel is being weaned, including the apostles, weaned from their ancestral customs. After the temple is destroyed, I don't think it should be a hard sell for even Jewish Christians to realize these things are no longer necessary for us, right? But during the interim, at least, Paul is not saying a Jew can't still do these things. Mm-hmm. He's just saying they don't justify you before God, and they aren't requisite in order to become a part of the people of God or remain part of the people of God.
Yeah, because of course, he also circumcised Timothy.
Yeah.
But he didn't want to infringe on Gentile freedom, but he also didn't want to impede the mission. And that's where Paul says, I became all things to all men. The other day I was talking to a guy, and he says, right there, Paul's telling you he's a liar.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that a lot. That's
You've heard
standard.
this a lot.
Muslims especially love it.
They like it.
I mean, we hear it. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think when I hear people say stuff like this, I'm thinking, this tells me something about them, right? So when I hear a Muslim look at the Bible and then get some perverted idea from it that I never thought in my life, and none of the Christians I've known for 30 years have ever said, it reflects to me more on them than it does the text itself, right? It's telling me these guys have a particular set of lenses here that cause them to see things a certain way.
Almost like they see it the way Muhammad might have seen it. Yeah.
So they're looking at this, and if you or I, if people of goodwill hear something, we take things a certain way. If people that are bent against something, they're going to take it another way. So when you and I hear that, becoming all things to all men, we just think of a person who's not making an issue out of things that are indifferent. That's how we hear it. Like, I'm not going to. I think it is
fulfilling in a way Israel's role in a new covenant context to be a light to the world, to light to the nations. That's what I think. Yeah, he's simply fulfilling that mandate. And
not being unnecessarily offensive, not causing stumbling blocks over things that aren't necessary. So
there's a fish that's got a quarter in its mouth. Go grab it. We don't want to offend him. Yeah.
Anyways,
I got some other questions we'll try to get to, but let's switch to this. Briefly talk about. Okay, you guys are sitting here quoting from this guy's letters. How do you know Paul wrote these letters? All the scholars say he only wrote 7. Maybe he didn't even write 7. What do you think of the whole Pauline authorship with the epistles?
Well, it says something if the scholars that are otherwise hostile to Christianity, or at least to be more neutral, don't agree with it, are pretty widely agreed on 7, right? I remember reading, I forget who it was now, it was a long, long time ago, but I thought it was really interesting. This scholar mentioned 1 Corinthians as one of the best attested books of the ancient world. Now, I've heard that kind of statement made about certain events and things like that, but this was interesting to me. He's talking about a particular book of Paul's written in the early 50s. So typically people give as a date for it 52 to 54. This is a really early epistle then, and it's one of the best attested. And the reason it stuck in my mind is because it sort of led me off into a study. Okay, this guy's saying it's so widely attested, then I want to find these statements about it. And I wasn't doing this as a skeptic. I just found the statement intriguing. And so I started looking, and there's like an incredible amount of people that mention Corinthians. So, I mean, just think, for example, Clement of Rome. It's one of the earliest extant post-apostolic books that we have. He's writing to the Corinthians from Rome, and in the epistle to these Corinthians, he makes reference to Paul's epistle to them.
Right.
He's actually
like 95. That's like 95 AD.
Yeah, and some people even put it earlier.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah, because, I mean, there's just different factors. But without going into that, 95 is like outside limit, right? It's and that's incredibly early. He's writing to them about an epistle that nobody questions they are in possession of. They are the people to whom that epistle was originally sent. Obviously, later, but I mean, the point is, this would have been for them like their claim to fame. We're the people who received this epistle, right? So that's who they were. That's their identity. And Clement of Rome's writing to them, taking it as a given that they are these people and so forth. But so you get stuff like that. And if you give us 7 epistles of Paul, that's, I don't know why they're begrudging the pastorals. I mean, I know why, but it's like, well, I could go a whole year without reading the pastoral epistles. Does that that doesn't slow my Christian roll?
You're going to hell, man. Definitely.
I'm just saying, it's like, how many of you have read Philemon in the last several months?
Here, I'm going to change your name on the screen because this is from last night's show.
I am the new D New.
Yeah. And I'm going to look at
the old D New.
And I'm going to look at a PDF with you for a second. By the way, shout out to, looks like we have 2 mods up in here, D New and Nate2D2. Thank you guys very much. And thank you both for making last year super dope, especially towards the end with the Christmas and all that kind of stuff. Appreciate that. And we got some great mods. Now I got something else I'm trying to look at, a PDF to look at together here about some of this stuff relating to Paul's authorship. But can you talk briefly about Paul's apostolic authority? Do you think it was legitimate, his apostolic authority?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because some people say, it's a question, it's a problem.
Well, I kind of alluded earlier to something that I'll bring back up here. In the Old Testament, I mentioned that when prophets are called, they're called immediately by God. This is important because the role of a prophet was something of a prosecuting attorney. A prophet is being raised up to upbraid people for their unfaithfulness to the covenant and call them back to obedience, and that's going to bring with it a lot of opposition. So you look at Elijah being opposed. All the prophets are, for the most part, opposed. So a prophet has to have some thing underneath his feet as he's about to experience all this. So, what's going to help them weather the storm? Think of Isaiah. Isaiah is told that in his ministry, he's going to preach and people aren't going to listen, right? Go to this people and say, be you ever hearing, but never understanding, ever seeing, but never perceiving. The heart of this people has become calloused and so forth. So Isaiah is already told at the beginning of his mission that he's going to be resisted and people aren't going to listen to him. What's going to help him stay the course? Well, he just heard these words from the Lord, who's portrayed in awesome majesty in the temple. The train of his robe fills the temple. The seraphim are crying out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. That's what's going to help him stay the course. So what is it going to take in the case of somebody like Paul, who's going to be persecuted to the nth degree. He's going to be opposed. He's not going to have a lot of easy, there's not going to be an acceptance of Paul very easily. It's going to be hard won. Everybody, even Christians, are going to be at arm's length with Paul until it's evident to them that he's on their side. So when you look at Paul and when he describes his apostolic bona fides, he makes it clear that it stems from his Damascus Road experience. In Galatians 1, so not just Acts, right? In Galatians 1, Paul says, and this is easily missed by people, but at the beginning of the epistle, he says, Paul, an apostle, not from men, nor through man, but Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. Several interesting things here. Paul, you might think he's being a little bit redundant. He says, an apostle not from men nor through man. But this actually negates two different things. One thing that Paul's negating is that his authority is merely human. It's not from men. Men are not the origin of Paul's authority. Neither is it through man. A pastor, for example, has authority from Christ, but this is mediated through men, right? Through the laying on of hands, people become ministers. So there's a mediated authority. It's real authority, but it's mediated. Paul's saying his authority didn't originate with men, nor was it passed on to him through men. He received it, by contrast, from Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. Now, notice again how Paul's saying something about Jesus. If it's not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead, on what side of the creator-creature divide is he putting Christ?
Right.
Christ is a divine person.
Good point.
And when you go down in Galatians 1, and just pull it up here real quick.
You want to share
Paul
your screen?
said, oh, I could, if you want.
If you want, or I can just bring up Galatians 1.
Oh, yeah, actually it tells me I can't. It doesn't like me.
What? Everybody's able to share the screen.
It says, Google Chrome is required for screen sharing. That's what it's telling me. But Galatians 1, Paul says, again, I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man, for I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to talk about the profound change that took place. And he also expresses this by the statement that God revealed his Son in Paul. So this Damascus Road experience where he had a revelation from Christ was also internally transformative. So this is Paul's way of describing it. And then he goes to great lengths saying that he didn't immediately rush to the apostles. This is a way of underscoring the point that he didn't get his authority from them. He didn't even go up to see any of them until after quite a number of years. And even then, it was only to become acquainted with Peter, not to become his disciple. He stayed with him for about 15 days. And that's it, right? Until later he goes up to Jerusalem for a conference.
Yeah, that's another thing people try to say. How many times did Paul go to Jerusalem? Trying to put the Acts together with the epistles can get tricky in relationship to that,
Well,
Okay,
yeah,
so-
it can. I mean, some
Go
would
ahead.
say it was in Acts 11. Some would say Acts 15. That's what Paul's talking
Yeah.
about when he mentions his first trip up there or whatever. But there are arguments back and forth. I mean, that doesn't prove that these. If you can try and argue the case in different ways, you have to definitely prove your particular view and then show how it's contradictory in order for that to be a conclusive argument, right? I mean, again, here's an area where Christians will dispute the relevant evidence. Which occasion is Paul referring to, right? How we reconcile these things depends on which occasion he's talking about.
Yes. All right, well, let's take a look at some of this authorship stuff, specifically 1 Timothy. I think, 1 Timothy is very important, and it's got a lot of stuff in there, and it is definitely one of the ones that people say, well, Paul didn't write that. He didn't write First Timothy. Some of the reasons they usually give for why Paul didn't write First Timothy are varied, but a key one, a big one, is vocabulary usage. Vocabulary usage. The words that are actually used in Greek, they say, are not characteristic of Pauline writing. And of course, they're using that with the seven they accept to say that. So I would say First Timothy is not a forgery, because that's really what you get. They call it pseudepigrapha. But, just like, remember, Bart Ehrman's book title is called Forged, and there's a reason, because he's saying it's a forgery. Level of dishonesty involved with that.
You know what? If I had the interest in spending this much time on Ehrman's stuff, it'd be interesting to go through his book and do the same thing, and show how certain books don't use certain vocabulary and other books do. That's in the nature of the case what you're going to have depending on the different things you're writing about.
Right.
The pastorals are dealing with things that fall under what we think of in terms of pastoral office and that sort of thing, right? Ecclesiastical issues. Of course, there's going to be some differences in vocabulary with that sort of thing. And it's kind of like you hear the same thing when it comes to the book of Revelation. It couldn't have been written by the same person who authored the fourth gospel and the three epistles because of the way that it's written. One thing to think about, I'm just giving an analogy for how you could have the same person writing in different styles. First of all, think if you were in this situation. You're on an island to which you've been banished, and now you're having these incredibly fantastic visions. What do you think your writing is as you're looking at all this and you're writing it all down? Do you think it's going to look like everything else you've ever written? Do you think if you were on an island getting visions like John was getting, it would look like Barack Obama and the Hebrew Israelites? Or I'm alluding to your book,
yes,
right? By that,
you are. I see. I like it.
Of course, it's going to look different. Well, not as dramatic in the case of the pastorals, but Paul is writing on different issues, so I don't understand why these sorts of things are made so important in terms of determining authorship to certain groups of people.
Right. Real quick, I see Mr. Green asking about where the discussion with myself and Mr. Valiant is. It is on Soneta's channel, as Genu answered. There's another one that's on Paradigm Shift 314. My plan is to upload it tomorrow. But I've got to be careful because I uploaded a short with Mr. Valiant, and he sent a privacy complaint after me on YouTube. Could someone check to see if that short is still up? I wonder if he was successful in getting it taken down. We'll find out. But either way, I'm going to upload it. So here's some reasons to talk about this. Different vocabulary, just as we alluded to just now. Let's talk a little bit about this claim of different vocabulary. What they'll generally say is, well, the vocabulary used there in 1 Timothy, it didn't originate until the 2nd century. If you look, that's where you see these kinds of words being used. It's in 2nd century Christian writing. And so it can't have been Paul that wrote this because of that. William Mounce, in his pastoral epistles commentary, in the word commentary, number 46, and he's known to have facility with the Greek. He says, of the vocabulary in the pastorals not found elsewhere in Paul. So, by the way, notice there's a recognition that there is vocabulary in the pastorals. What are the pastorals, everyone? It's 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Those are the pastoral epistles. There's 3. Do they count Philemon as a pastoral epistle? I don't know if they do. I don't know. Anyways, of the vocabulary in the pastorals not found elsewhere in Paul, over 90% can be found in writings prior to AD 50. Now that's significant. If we're putting Paul's death 64 or so, and if you can find 90% of this stuff in writings prior to 50 AD, that's important. Meaning, they're saying it originated in the 2nd century. Maybe it's a case that in Christian writings, some of the vocabulary not found elsewhere in the pastorals had more prominence or more frequency later on, but that doesn't mean it was not before then. And so therefore Paul could not have written it. And I'm giving you one stat from William Mounce to show that that's the case. Of the vocabulary that's not found in the other parts of Paul in the pastoral epistles, 90% can be found prior to AD 50. And that's could be, depending on where you put Timothy, but that's before he would have written 1 Timothy, for example. In the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Dictionary, Douglas, Tenney, and Silva say, detailed study has shown that the pastoral letters contained not one single word that was foreign to the age in which Paul lived and could not have been used by him. Saying that when you really look at the claims, whether say it's 2nd century, a more careful analysis shows that it's not the case. None of these things are foreign to the 1st century. So that's important to understand, because if I pop open, let's say I'm in New Testament introduction at community college, just for example, pop open my New Testament little textbook there, it's going to probably say something like this. We know these weren't written by Paul because of, and you're, oh, okay, well, the vocabulary didn't exist. It's kind of like they're almost like they're claiming that Paul was using the word internet, but he was using that word in 1975 or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Or whenever, when somebody most likely would not have known, unless it was Al Gore, since he had invented it.
Invented the internet, yeah.
Yeah. Not sure the date on that, but Carson and Moo, in their excellent New Testament survey, page 556, say, statistical arguments regarding Paul's vocabulary have proved to be quite weak. And you may say, well, that's just the fundamentalists. That's just the apologists. That's just the confessional religious zealot guy saying that. Well, I want to show you something. I'm going to skip a couple slides. I'm going to go back to those in a second. Look at what Bart Ehrman says in chapter 3 in Forge. Probably not too much stock should be placed in mere numbers. Everyone, after all, uses different words on different occasions, and most of us have a much richer stock of vocabulary than shows up in any given set of letters we write. It's so weird he says that, but he's saying that in the Forge book. Now, I think what he's saying is, first of all, this is part of the argument, but I don't hinge everything on it. He would say there's other things, because in the book Forge, the whole point is that they're writing in other people's names, you know, in a lot of these documents. Early Christians were just essentially great forgers, and that's the point in a way, but they didn't think it was wrong, so hey, whatever. But this is what he says in chapter 3 of that same book, which I think is significant. I think that's interesting, don't you? Now, a couple of the things in relationship to this, letters and words and vocabulary, you can make objections to that from a statistician standpoint. First of all, the brevity of the epistles. So you don't really have a good sample size there. That's something to consider. And there's a bit of an assumption going on. These 3 aren't by Paul. The 7, and those other 6 aren't either. Just these 7 are. So you're matching like the 3 against the 7, but it's a really small sample size. You know, if Paul wrote the other 2 pastoral epistles, then guess what? He did use that vocabulary just in the pastoral epistles. But also lack of statistical controls. And this is an interesting point, this next point. And by the way, I'm taking some of these points from Testified, Eric Manning's channel. He's got a great channel. I'm going to try to interview him very soon. I love his work. And so shout out to him. Stats can't explain why these observable differences exist. Meaning, okay, there's some differences, but why? And Anthony, you brought this out in the beginning. Is it just that it's different authors? Or could it be something else, like different topics being dealt with, written to different individuals with certain challenges? These aren't written to churches, as Anthony pointed out. Different amanuenses, different secretaries, basically. The pastoral epistles are not they're not addressed by definition to entire congregations. And understand, Paul wrote for over 25 years. He would be at the end of his life during these pastorals. That should be considered in these discussions. Don't you think, Anthony?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, people's vocabulary should grow. And when you think about Christianity as a movement, it's growing and it's moving, it's expanding into different areas. People would begin to coin terms for things that previously didn't have a term for them because the things that they're referring to weren't realities. So, think of church offices, for example. Not that there's no prior precedent for them, but some of these things are going to take on a new color, right? In the past, a priest would have been the one who was primarily instructing people. Well, in the New Testament, while there are still going to be people that teach, other things associated with the work of a priest aren't still operative, like making sacrifices. So are you going to continue to use the word priest, or will other terms be more prominent? So, you're going to get development, additional language, certainly, the more time goes on.
Yeah, and there's a place where Aaron even says, a lot of the arguments I've made here could be radically recalibrated. And now I'm paraphrasing him, okay? This is not a quote. Just letting everyone know that. But basically, could be thrown out the window if people are writing using secretaries who have a hand in the writing or amanuenses, which I think explains the difference, especially between 1 Peter and 2 Peter. Now, I know we're talking about Paul, but that's a big one right there. What about this? Another argument they give, Anthony, is, well, the church wasn't that developed yet. And yet you have Paul talking about qualifications for elders in Timothy and Titus. Have you heard this one?
Well, that would just be begging the question. I mean, how do they know they didn't have those offices already? When I mentioned the term for, I just mentioned presbyters, or, instead of priests, elders, the word for elder in Greek is presbyter, presbyteros. Alternatively, they're called episkopoi, bishops, overseers. It's the same office, just different terms are used for it. That, even though there is something going on especially relevant to the church, it's not like this had no prior precedent. In the synagogue, which wasn't part of the temple service, but the synagogues that are established in places, they had elders. The synagogues were governed by elders. Mm-hmm. And so you essentially have already a model for the church in how the synagogue functioned. Paul's reflecting the new reality where the temple, the priesthood, and all that is no longer the central thing. So there's no reason that Paul can't already be talking about this sort of thing. I mean, what do you have these churches that are existing for decades without any sense of leadership? That doesn't make any sense.
Well, a lot of times they'll say, well, look at the Corinthian church and these other ones. They're more pneumatic driven, these spirit-led churches versus the structure now that you see in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. But let's bring out some stuff here, Anthony. And some of this you've already alluded to. Philippians 1:1, how's that open? Anybody remember? Someone look at Philippians 1:1, drop it in the live chat. Now, why is Philippians significant? That's one of the 7 that even critics say Paul wrote. Right? That's one of the 7. They say the 7 genuine epistles or letters, right? Well, how's Philippians 1:1 open? Who's there in Philippians 1:1? Anybody see it? Do you see it?
Overseers and deacons.
Yeah, what's the Greek word there?
I believe, well, if it says overseers, it would be the term for bishop, episkopoi.
You got what translation do you have in front of you? I'm just curious.
I don't have it in front of me. Hold on. I could pull it up.
Oh, you just were quoting from memory. Okay, sorry. There, Ham Sunshine dropped it. Paul and Timothy, servants of Jesus Christ, to all God's holy people in Christ Jesus at Philippi, together with the overseers and deacons. And then John A. also drops alternative translation, which I appreciate. Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with the bishops and deacons. And then warrior woman, Paul and Timothy, servants of Jesus Christ, to all God's holy people in Christ Jesus at Philippi, together with the overseers and deacons. So here's the point that you already see in Philippi, there's overseers and deacons. Notice that's what it is. It's the elders and the deacons, because overseers is basically what it is. Elders and deacons, that's who's there. He gives a shout out to them as well. Now, Certainly there could be, I don't know if we want to say some kind of development. Like, this is clearly all in process. Paul's going on the missionary journeys, and people are brand new Christians, and you got Gentiles coming in. There's a lot going on in the early church. No doubt about that. But that's part of what Paul is doing. So what's it say in Titus? Hey, I left you there to set an order, and here's the qualifications. So there's these formative stages, but it wasn't entirely out of nowhere. And as Anthony brought up, there was some precedent within the synagogue system. And then you see in Philippians 1 as well. But then when you get to Acts, in Acts 8:14-23, in Acts 20:17-35, I believe it also mentions elders in those situations. Now, the situation with Stephen and the others, that's a different question. It never uses the word deacons for those people who were selected, but the role seems awfully similar to deacons. I prefer the term, it's not in the text, but I prefer the term as far as the concept of proto-deacon. They seem to be proto-deacons in their function in my mind. I'm talking about Stephen and the others who were selected for the food distribution.
In Acts 6, yeah. And notice this develops on the already given reality that there is a teaching office, right? So the apostles say it's not right that we be distracted by this.
Right.
We're supposed to be preaching and teaching and so forth. So once you get this, what you're calling proto-deacon office, you've got the essential things that Paul is talking about in his epistles, a teaching, leading office, and then a diaconal office.
And by the way, everyone, we're talking about Acts chapter 6, where the 7 are chosen to serve, by the way. I don't know, do you call those guys proto-deacons, or what do you have something for them?
I would just think of them as deacons, but I understand what you're saying. It doesn't use the term there.
But either way. And then when you get to, but that's a great point what he just brought up. I hope everyone caught it. The way he explained it was perfect, that you already have people dedicated to the teaching. That's what they're doing. They're saying, hey, look, we shouldn't stop or decrease in that to deal with food distribution, but let's get someone who will do that. There it is right there. It's forming as we see it. And this is before Paul's entrance into the scene, ladies and gentlemen. Then in 1 Thessalonians 5:12, Romans 12:7, 1 Corinthians 16:15-17, you also see sort of leaders mentioned. And then if you want to count Hebrews, I think you see that as well. And then I believe in Romans 16, I believe you see deacon. There's some debate about how to translate that, but I believe that's the case. And so it's not as a foreign. Now, I wouldn't deny there's development and these things are in flux and progress that are happening right then. But to act as if it's impossible, the ecclesiastical structure is much too advanced during the time these letters were written versus the pneumatic-led type of ecclesiastical bodies that we see in the mid-first century that the Apostle Paul would have been a part of. So clearly, he could not have written these pastoral epistles. That plus the fact that the vocabulary is later than the date of when he lived clearly tell us that he did not write these pastoral epistles. Right? I hope we just gave the other side to that argument, though, because that's the way they'll kind of say it. Real quick, I want to look at one other thing here. Hold on. Right here, which has to do with canonical issues in 1 Timothy. And when you look, you do see these pastorals getting shout-outs pretty early. Obviously, the Gospels take center stage, okay, obviously. Acts is prominent. But you see references and allusions. I believe it should say references and allusions because I think the left side is my references and the right side are my allusions. 1 Clement 2, Didache 15, Polycarp in his epistle to the Philippians 4, 5, and 12. I think those are references. Then, and maybe I got it the other way around. Now I'm confusing myself, and now I got to go back and look at my notes when I created this. Which one's the allusions? Which one's the references? Maybe it's the other way around, actually. Irenaeus, Clement, Theophilus, Tertullian, Origen, Eusebius. And the reason why I bring that all up is that's all pre-Nicene for what it's worth. Shout out to Carm M in the live chat. How are you doing, Carm? Good to see you. And J Soul as well, and Warrior Woman as well. We got quite the squad up in here. So I think that's important. And I'll just recommend a couple articles and then ask some other questions about the historical Paul. Great articles here by Eric Manning. These are all at crossexamine.org. He also has his own website, but here they're written at CrossExamine. Is Bart Ehrman right when he says that Acts contradicts Paul's letters? I believe I shared that article the other day on my Facebook. Then another one, the historical Paul versus a legendary Paul. And then another one, forgery in the Bible, where 1st and 2nd Timothy really forged part 1 and part 2. He's got those 3 amongst some other great stuff. Actually, it's 4. And so I just recommend those to you. Anything else you want to say about that? And you know what else I'd like to know? Who are some of your favorite writers, scholars, theologians on Paul that you really like?
Yeah, so some would depend on what aspect of Pauline Studies you're interested in. But one person I like that many people may not have heard of is Robert Raymond.
Oh,
he wrote a great
Presbyterian on us.
Yeah, he wrote a great systematic theology, which people might know about. He's written a number of other things as well, but he did a book on Paul. As best I recall, it's called Missionary Theologian.
Okay.
So he's not just looking at what Paul did, but doing so with a view to his theology as well. Another person I really like, old standard F.F. Bruce, in his book on Paul, Apostle of the Heart Set Free.
Great book.
Yeah, he does a good job of infusing it with gospel light. So he's focusing on the power of the gospel, the truth of the gospel, what Paul proclaimed, the difference it made in the case of Paul and those he ministered to. So he's not just talking about the facts, but the results of the facts, how these things applied to Paul and to others. Who else? There's a number of other really good books. Did you find
Raymond's systematic to be slightly more philosophical than the average systematic, or am I wrong? Not in a bad way.
One thing it depends, I guess, what section you're talking about. He could focus to some degree on epistemology, which a lot of systematics don't. But one thing I like about Raymond's systematic theology, it's not my go-to systematic, but one thing I like about it is a lot of systematic theologies, they talk about the issues, they take the exegesis on a lot of issues for granted. So they don't stop and explain why the grammar, the syntax, the context supports this way of using the verse. They're assuming that you're able to do that, and they're just developing then on the basis of what these texts are taken to mean. But Raymond will actually stop and engage in exegesis. So it's in some ways like a commentary, even though it's not a continuing commentary. He's not just going through one book. He's going doctrine by doctrine. So I like that. But he does focus a lot on, he was part of the whole heyday of the Bahnsen-Clark controversy and their differences over epistemology. So it factors into his stuff a lot.
Yeah, I like Raymond, though. I like Raymond over there at Covenant. Smart guy. So we got a lot of people that sometimes people forget about. Earlier you mentioned in 1 Clement 95 AD where he mentioned Paul's writings. I got that quote, actually. I forgot to share it earlier. Take up the epistle of the blessed apostle, Paul. To be sure, he sent you a letter in the Spirit concerning himself and Cephas and Apollos. So obviously he's referring to 1 Corinthians there. And then earlier, proclaimer of the gospel of Jesus put a comment that actually is also on the screen. 2 Peter 3:16 shows that Peter viewed Paul's writings as graphos. That's a word used for scripture. He was referring, and also in that section, 2 Peter 3:16, to a plurality of Paul's letters as equal to the graphos in relationship to the Old Testament, because that's the other part that he would be referring to there. And that's important. Now, everyone should be aware, we're taking this as that's the fact. If you get into critical studies, almost none of them are going to say that Peter wrote 2 Peter. Just be aware. You should be aware of that. That's one that almost is like There's people that actually will argue. I think maybe Paul did write First Timothy. Even some critical scholars, you'll find them saying, First Timothy, I think he did write it. You'll see that. And sometimes like Colossians and Ephesians, because one of those they don't accept. I think it's Ephesians, and sometimes you'll see people argue for it. But when it comes to Second Peter, that's one of the hardest ones, as it were. But nonetheless, we do share that that's important to understand. And then another thing that I think is interesting is, remember that there is public reading of canonical books. So Colossians 4:16, Paul told the churches to read the letter publicly, to have it read in the church of the Laodiceans. 1 Thessalonians 5:27, Paul instructs his audience to read the letter publicly to all the brethren. Revelation, the writer seems to expect the audience to be reading this in the writing that he wrote aloud, Revelation 1:3. 1 Timothy 4:13, Paul instructs Timothy to devote himself to the public reading of Scripture, which is interesting if his writings are being read in these new covenant gatherings. In the mid-2nd century, Justin Martyr said this: on the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. And so you see some examples there. There's more I would like to share there, but we'll probably have to stop there as far as that. But I do have on the screen in relationship to canonical information, some other stuff. So, Anthony, if people why do you think it's important for Christians to understand who Paul is, historical Paul, and maybe be aware of some of the issues in relationship to critical scholarship, all that kind of stuff? I think today is an important session, and I think maybe some of this stuff is more important than Christians realize, especially even just in apologetics. But reiterate why it is important. Why does it matter?
Well, if Christians are doing what they should be doing, evangelizing, and that can take different forms. Some people can be doing it more vocationally. It's something that they're doing every day, day in, day out on the mission field or something like that, or they could be doing it as the occasion allows. They're at the supermarket and start talking to somebody. If they're doing that as they should be, then this sort of thing is going to come up. And what are they going to say? As Christians, one of the things I've often thought about when it comes to some of these issues, skeptics think they have a whole lot more going for them, in part because we're so far out from some of these things that the reasons that earlier Christians had for accepting certain things is not as accessible to us, right? When something's being challenged, people are very studious, dutiful in acquiring the evidence for it.
Right.
But once it becomes established, people begin to forget about that. And it's established, so you're taking it as a given. Well, those people in that position can then be more easily challenged by people, not realizing that the only reason that they can't defend it at this point is because it was already defended,
right?
And it got its place. Why do I need to keep revisiting this, right? So we have good evidence. It's just it's easy for people in certain contexts to not focus on it at all. Why would you focus on it in the church where we already know what these evidences are? It's been firmly established for us. But now that it's being challenged, what are we going to do? And so if you're going to witness, this is going to come up. You're going to have to be able to defend it to some degree.
I agree.
That's one reason.
All right. I think I need to let my dog out real quick. Can you wax eloquent on Paul for just a second here?
Sure. I'll think of something.
There's a couple of comments in the chat as well.
So speaking of dogs and Paul.
Yeah.
Paul, no, I'm saying I'm talking. So you're supposed to be letting the dog out. You're supposed
Hold
to.
on.
Where did I go?
Sorry. I got to get you back on the screen. I'm sorry. Just a second here.
I've been given you let your dog out. All right. Wrong dog.
There we go.
You showed me the door. I'm in the doghouse. I was gonna say, speaking of dogs and Paul referred to the Judaizers as dogs. I know that's probably not quite what Vocab wanted me to do. Let's see. I'll read some comments. So, Truth Defenders is responding to somebody saying, ignorant Muslims often attack and dismiss Paul in his writings. Also, I've noticed a lot of folks calling themselves Christians dismissing and attacking Paul. This is important. Yeah, so that would be another reason that we should know these things in order to defend Paul against people of other religious persuasions or people who pretend to be Christian but are down on Paul. So Muslims will attack Paul. It's a strange thing because earlier Muslims didn't attack Paul. All that's happening today on the apologetic front with Muslims is they're always riding the wave of liberal scholarship. Truth Defenders made a comment about Muslims attacking Paul and other people who claim to be Christians attacking Paul. And I was making the point that it's strange because earlier Muslims didn't attack Paul. There's references, positive references to Paul in Muslim writings.
You're going way back
Muslims,
for that. Right?
Yeah, but
or Middle
Muslims
Ages,
didn't start
maybe?
Yeah, I mean, but I'm thinking even earlier.
Yeah,
so
way back.
The Syria literature, they refer to Paul as Burrus. They have different Arabized names for these figures, but they got this from liberal scholarship. Liberals wanted to drive a wedge between Paul and I was listening. In fact, here's the funny thing. So you debated this guy the other day that flipped out. I didn't get to see that whole thing, but I did see him losing it, blew his stack. What's interesting, so I had just seen him. I had never seen him before, except a couple of days before your debate, I saw him on with Tovia Singer. And they were attacking Paul. Yeah. They were attacking Paul. So when I saw you and this guy flipping I'm like, where did I see this guy? Just recently. And I realized he was on with him, and he was attacking Paul. So it's very popular now for Jewish groups to do it, or at least anti-missionaries like Tovia Singer. That's why he had this guy on, because this guy was joining him in attacking Paul. And you get Muslims doing it. You get Hebrew roots groups to some extent doing it. Not all of them. Some try and harmonize Paul with their Hebrew roots ideas, right? So all of this makes it important to be able to defend Paul. I'm not the expert you are in Hebrew Israelism, but I know that some Hebrew Israelite groups reject Paul.
Yep, he got stuff
what are you
wrong.
Gonna do?
He changed stuff, all that kind of stuff.
I mean, one of the things that I've tried to do is learn how to defend things by tying one arm behind my back. In other words, if I could only appeal to the Old Testament, how would I defend this? Right. If I could only appeal to the Synoptics and not John, how would I defend this? Because groups are all over the map. And so what are you going to do? I mean, you could spend the time arguing with a person who rejects Paul and show why they should accept him, or you might not think you have enough time to do that, and so why not just go to those sources they claim to accept? Right. So these are issues of strategy, but at the end of the day, you're going to want to be able to defend people like Paul or anybody that's being rejected.
That's good. That's good. Tell us one more time, Anthony Rogers, please, where to find your next two debates coming up.
So on January 5th, I'm debating Sean Griffin from Kingdom in Context on the question, does God the Father have a body? So he's a worshiper of a finite God, a sort of Olympian deity dressed up in Christian garb. He calls him God the Father, but he's more like Zeus or Hercules. But that's going to take place on the Gospel Truth Channel. I think it's at 8 p.m., but if you go over to the Gospel Truth Channel, you'll be able to
I'm going to drop
verify
the link
that
right now, and then I'm going to show the screen.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And then at the end of the month, on the 29th, I'll be debating the same guy on the doctrine of the Trinity. Is it biblical, on a different channel called Standing for Truth Channel.
Oh, okay. Standing for Truth.
Yeah. So one's on the Gospel Truth, the other's on Standing for Truth. Both are against the same misguided soul.
Was Was I on Standing for Truth before?
Um,
I feel like I was. I recognize this guy. I feel like someone tell me. I feel like I was.
The channel focuses a lot on creationism.
Okay.
So that's not all they do, but he hosts debates and things like that. But their main focus is usually on creation versus evolution type things.
Okay, I'm gonna show both of these real quick. Okay, let me ask you this, because you're a smart guy, you're a full-grown adult, and you're sitting around here studying stuff and debating wild people on the internet. The fact that you do it, I feel like gives me a little justification for doing it too, because sometimes people are like, why are you doing this? Shouldn't you be out making some money or like lifting weights? And maybe they're right about the second one or something. But why do you do this? Because you're one of the most prolific debaters. Why, Anthony Rogers?
So I've never lost sight of who I was when Christ found me. I know a lot of people, first of all, if they weren't converted and are just hypocrites, where did I go again? I disappeared. Can you hear me still?
Come back. You're going to come back. Sorry.
But you can hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you. Sorry, I'm just making some changes.
So I don't want to suggest that everybody has to have some radical memory of when they became Christians. There are people that are raised in Christian homes and knew Christ as long as they knew their parents. If I were to ask somebody, when did you first start loving your mother, most people would not be able to tell you, right? They've loved their mother as long as they can remember, right? Well, some people grew up in a household where Christ was known and proclaimed, and they just can't remember when that took place, and that's fine. But I was converted from a radically sinful lifestyle. I was a criminal, gangbanger on the streets of California, a thief, a crook, and I've never lost sight of that. I was overjoyed when I was converted. I couldn't believe the forgiveness of sins that I received from Christ. And I've never gotten so far away from that, even though Christ has wrought wonderful things in my life, changed my way of thinking, my outlook, my behavior. I know that whatever I am today is nothing I would be if Christ didn't visit me, right? If he didn't come and change me. And so I've always desired to tell people about him, and I've never lost that zeal. And so that's why I do it. I can't think of anything better to be doing with my time. But I do work. Good. The way you set it up was sort of like, yeah. I've had for the past many years had several jobs at once. So I do the prison ministry. Yeah, I was working for Ligonier for at least 5 years up until last December. I preach regularly on Sundays for churches that don't currently have a pastor. I do all sorts of things. So I go speak at conferences. I'm always busy, but happily, all these things are things that I love. I love witnessing. I love speaking at conferences. I love telling people about Christ. So they all work together.
So here's the one, Standing for Truth.
There it is.
Does the Bible teach the doctrine of the Trinity? 27 days versus Sean Griffin.
That's the second one. So that's the other one's coming up on Friday.
We'll
see if he wants to debate the Trinity.
Huh?
I said we'll see if he wants to debate the Trinity after we do this debate on Friday.
Hey, this is kind of cool, man. Look.
Yeah, there you are.
We're right. The fact we're right next to each other, huh?
Yeah.
I like it. You
were on that guy's channel the other day.
Yeah, I was on his channel the other day. What's this? He's got a panel coming up on Arminianism.
Open panel, apparently.
Is it with Arminians?
2 open spots. I think, I can't see, my eyes aren't so good. I think the two, or at least one of the guys there, I think is an Arminian. So there's a spot open for others.
Yeah, it looks like it.
You could be that question mark.
The question mark is God not knowing who's...
not
knowing who the elect are.
I like the background of this. Marlon. These,
he's got a skeleton with the muscles.
Yeah,
and the tendons and all that. I like it. James G says we need more ortho bro debates. Truth
I did one
Truth
not too long ago.
defenders.
You know,
Chances are, if you had your car stolen in Las Vegas, Anthony Rogers was part of that.
well, you know, it's in a sense, if within a certain time period, it would have been true. So we moved there from California when I was 17 in 1992, and I don't want to say too much, but I mean, I was pretty active there in disreputable behavior. And yeah, I will tell you this. So one of the things that I did that I was arrested for, again, back in 1992, so we're 30 years out, I took a car. I didn't know whose car it was. Later, I was chased. I got out of the car, took off. I was apprehended later, not in the car, but they claimed that I was in the car, and so they arrested me for it. And it turned out that the car belonged to Floyd Lamb Jr. Now, people that don't know anything about Vegas won't catch this, but if you go to Vegas, yeah, that was my background. I was called and saved out of it. So,
amen. Remember in San Diego? What did they call you? Crook.
Oh,
they called
David
me Shooter.
David killed me with all that.
David?
I don't know if you got... So what happened was we went up to the table of Uthman ibn Farouk.
Yeah, I was there, but I don't remember all the background.
Well,
like that.
So what happened is he was pretending like he didn't know David.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And then he said, "Aren't you the one they call Hammer Time?"
Yeah.
And David, because he's just so unaffected by stuff like that, was like, yeah. And so I knew about Uthman. I said, "Hey, didn't you used to be a gangbanger?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "What did they call you?" Now, I'd heard him say before that he was a gangbanger. I didn't know what they called him. I just know if you're in a gang, they call you something.
Yeah.
So then he says, "Shooter." And so what I'm trying to do now is level the playing field. He's trying to undermine David by calling him Hammer Time. So I said, "What did they call you?" He said, "Shooter." Well, what does it mean if you were a gangbanger and they call you Shooter? Clearly, you weren't doing anything good. And then David is like, "Oh, what did they used to call you?" Yeah, Uthman knew nothing about me. And David's like, "What did they call you?" And I'm like, "David."
Sometimes his strategy is different than what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And it's partially, too, it's like the difference in, like, my personality is, I don't care what anybody says about me, but I do take issue when they say something about a friend.
Right.
And so in my thinking, I'm like defending David. And David's thinking, he's like, I don't even recognize that this guy's making fun of me because it doesn't bother me at all, right?
Yeah. And so instead he starts making fun of you.
Yeah.
Well, that's Star Buddy. Well, thanks for coming on. I look forward to these debates. You make me want to debate more. I feel like I need to I feel like we need to do a tag team. I feel like I need to go debate on that other channel you're debating on. Now I'm like, it makes me want to be like, I got to do.
Let me just say, since you put it on the screen, I'm not what I'm not said. I'll debate Anthony on Christology right now. I say Jesus is the Christ. What say you, Anthony? Looks like he quit. I don't know. Is that satirical or not? But let me say this. First, it'd be, if you're serious about it.
I think he's talking about something else. I don't know. What is he talking about? I don't know.
Maybe I don't know. Maybe he's being facetious, but that would be a false antithesis, right? As a Christian, it's not either Jesus is the Christ or he's God. As Christians, we believe that God became incarnate and he is the Christ. But secondly, you have to disambiguate what's meant by the Christ. There were different conceptions of Messiah in the first century within Judaism. There were those who thought of a heavenly Messiah, those who thought of someone who was merely a human Davidic Messiah. There was the Messiah of Aaron, there was the Messiah ben Joseph, many different conceptions. I would argue, as Joel Marcus did, that when Mark in particular speaks of Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, he's not just saying that Jesus is the Christ and that's what he means by calling him Son of God. He's saying he is the Messiah in this sense, the Son of God. Because when you look at the question of the high priest in Mark 14, he says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God?" And then Jesus said, "I am. And you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven," and so forth, or seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And then the high priest tears his garments, saying, "You've heard it yourself. What further proof do we need of the blasphemy?" It wasn't blasphemous to claim to be a merely human Messiah. Bar Kokhba claimed to be the Messiah. That Egyptian claimed to be the Messiah. That Paul was confused with in Acts. Many people claim to be Messiah. You might prove that you're a loon to people. They might reject you, but it wouldn't be grounds for charging you with blasphemy and stoning you. Only if Christ was claiming to be the divine Messiah would it be blasphemous, if not true. So there's my opening case. I'm not what I'm not. Too bad you don't get a rebuttal. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm not what I'm not may have just been playing.
Yeah, maybe I can't tell. Can't tell. But I look forward to seeing what you're going to do in 2024, my friend. I'm hoping we go to ETS together in November. I'm working on submitting a paper for the regional conference in San Diego, if I can get my stuff together before the 31st.
And isn't the national conference in San Diego?
I think so, but there's a regional, and I've never read it a regional, and I think I might finally do it. So
I think I heard you say that. I only mentioned the national one because I was kind of thinking, I was thinking of going to see my mom in Nevada and then renting a car and driving down to San Diego for the conference.
You want to read it, the regional one?
Oh, I don't know about when is the regional one?
It's like in April.
What's the topic there?
I forget, but Tom Schreiner's the plenary.
Oh, okay.
We'll talk about it. We'll figure it out. Purely Grounded, I see your super chat. The dog is outside, but I'm going to give the dog a super snack when she comes back, okay? So thank you very much to you for that. And to everyone else here, happy 2024. Tomorrow, I'm going to upload a discussion. It's 2 different appearances of me versus James Valiant. It's not an official debate, but it's as close as we're going to get. And I'll upload it with some edits to make it smoother. You'll see. But you'll get a little sense there of what he purports and all that. And then he'll try to take the video down, and we'll see what happens. I don't know. All right, we'll see. All right, God bless. Peace out. Come back tomorrow where we make apologetics fun again.